In the last section, we spoke about how traditional React applications have an inherently long load time because it's always going to take some number of round trips to our server before it can start to show any content on the screen. In this video, we'll introduce server-side rendering and get a better sense of how it dramatically decreases the amount of time it takes to get content in front of a user. Let's get a sense of how this works by seeing server-side rendering in action. Now, just like the last video, I've taken the liberty of installing a boilerplate React project that makes use of server-side rendering. So this is a boilerplate project right here. It makes use of server-side rendering. Again, I've got my request log open on the right-hand side here. And just like before, I'm going to refresh the page, and then we'll take a look at some of the requests that are being made. Now I've got another request to localhost 3000. If I inspect this first initial request right here, I'll then hit the preview tab, and here is the initial HTML document that is sent to our browser from the server. If you'll recall, in the last video, when we looked at that initial HTML document, it was quite sparse. In other words, there was not a lot of content inside of that initial document. In this case, however, and this entire HTML document is all on one line, so I want to inspect the HTML document right here, but just to make sure it's a little bit more legible than having everything on one line, I'm going to paste it all into a little HTML formatter over here, so we can get a better idea of exactly what HTML is being sent down to us on that initial request. So here's that initial HTML document, and as we start to scroll through it, you're going to see that, wow, there really is a lot of content inside this initial HTML document, much unlike the one that we just saw in the last video. So remember, with traditional React apps like the one we looked at, the initial request fetches an HTML document with essentially just a script tag inside of it and nothing else. In this case, however, when we start using server-side rendering, we see an HTML document that has a tremendous amount of initial content inside of it. So forgetting for just a moment how this HTML document is generated, let's just think about the impact of sending a fully rendered HTML document to our users in terms of load time. So we're going to pull up another diagram. Here we go. Let me zoom in. So similar diagram to what we had before, but this really starts to illustrate how much more quickly users get content on their screen. In this world, the time to get content in front of our users' faces is dramatically simplified. From the initial request, the user gets back all the content that we want to show them on the screen, so far as the user is concerned. The page must have loaded up far more quickly than with a traditional React app. In a nutshell, this is what server-side rendering is all about. An unending focus on making sure that the user gets some usable, viewable HTML screen to view as soon as possible. But of course, you and I want to know a lot more about how this is working. So let's take a quick glance at a diagram to get a better sense of how this process really works. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated, but we're going to do just kind of a cursory look at this diagram right here, and then we're going to expand on this diagram a tremendous amount through the rest of the course. So I'm going to zoom in on it, just to make sure it's all nice and visible. There we go. Okay, so here's our first taste of server-side rendering and the flow behind it. Everything starts off, just like before, with the user entering some address or the URL for our application into the address bar of their browser. That makes an initial request to our server. Our server then immediately loads up all of the code for our React application in memory. So our server is very quickly going to be loading up our React application. The server will fetch any required data, like say a list of blog posts or a list of comments to show on the screen, whatever is necessary. The server will then take that data and render the React app. It will take all of the HTML that is generated by the React application and ship it down to our users. So as far as the user is concerned, that initial request leads to an HTML document that has a bunch of starting content visible on the screen. The process does not end there, however. Remember, HTML content is generally not very interactive. That's the entire point of using React. We use React to make dynamic, interactive applications. So after we ship down a document and the user gets some content on the screen, we still want to load up our React application. So just like we would in a traditional React app, after we load up that HTML document, we still make sure that we load up our JavaScript bundle. We go and get the bundle, we receive the bundle back, the React application boots up, makes any requests for follow-up data, gets data back from the server, and then renders the application on the screen again. So even when we start using server-side rendering, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're not using React on the client anymore. We still use React in the browser. We just defer loading of the React application to be a little bit further on along the process. Again, the entire key to this process is understanding that we want to get content visible on the screen as soon as possible. After that, we can treat our application as a normal React app, just as we are 100% used to doing in the past. Okay, so this video, we have done a kind of preliminary overview of how server-side rendered apps work. Of course, we cannot get a good sense of what's going on without putting this all together ourselves. So let's continue in the next section and discuss an application that we are going to build to get a better sense of how server-side rendering works.